My stepson sold my car to pay his debts. He did not ask. He did not warn me. He walked into the garage one morning while I was at work, called a buyer he had already lined up, signed paperwork using a title he had stolen from my filing cabinet, and handed over the keys to a $62,000 vehicle that he had zero legal right to touch. When I confronted him that evening, he stood in my kitchen with his arms crossed and a look on his face that told me he had been rehearsing this moment. He said, "What are you going to do about it?" He said it with a smirk. He was 20 years old, living in my house, eating my food, driving a truck I was paying insurance on, enrolled in a university whose tuition I had been covering since the day I married his mother 6 years before. He had done the math the way young men who have never worked for anything did the math. He added up everything he stood to inherit, and he decided that waiting was for people who had something to lose. He had calculated that I would do nothing. He was 20 years old, and he had made the most expensive miscalculation of his life. By the time he came home the next evening, I had canceled the college enrollment, frozen the trust fund, called the property manager who oversaw the house and had the locks rekeyed, and left a folded piece of paper taped to the front door with 3 words on it. "Welcome to the real world." He stood on that porch for a long time before he called his mother. I know because the neighbor called me and told me. Before I tell you what happened after that night, the calls, the lawyers, the confrontation with his mother that almost ended my marriage before we decided the truth mattered more than being comfortable, I want to take you back to where this actually started. Not the garage, not the smirk before all of it. To a man who built everything he had from a starting point that made 20-year-old comfort look like a fantasy. To the specific kind of patience that a person developed when they understood, from very early in life, that nothing was coming from anywhere that they had not built themselves. And to a stepson who had been watching that patience his entire adolescence and had mistaken it for weakness. Hit like right now. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in my position? Let us start from the very beginning. My name is Warren Cole, and I am 58 years old. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a neighborhood where the houses were close together and the lawns were kept, and the people who lived there worked hard and expected their children to do the same. My father, Gene, drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor for 31 years. Same route, same schedule, same steel thermos of coffee he filled every morning before he left the house at 4:45 a.m. He was not a man who talked about money. He was a man who managed it. Every dollar that came into our house was accounted for before it arrived. My mother surely kept a handwritten ledger in the kitchen drawer, the kind where income went in one column and expenses went in another, and the discipline of that ledger was the discipline of our entire household. You knew what things cost. You knew what you had. You spent within the first number and saved whatever gap existed between the two. There were 3 of us kids. I was the middle. My older brother Dennis went into the military straight out of high school. My younger sister Paula got a scholarship to the University of Oklahoma and became an accountant, which surprised exactly nobody who had watched her with numbers since she was 8 years old. I was the one who did not fit a clean category. I was not a bad student. I was not a great one. I was the kind of student who paid attention when the material connected to something real and mentally checked out when it did not, which meant my grades were a patchwork of highs in the classes I cared about and acceptable but uninspiring marks in the ones I did not. What I was good at from a genuinely early age was reading people. Not manipulating them, reading them, understanding what someone wanted before they said it, understanding what a situation required before the situation made it obvious, understanding which conversations were about the surface subject and which ones were about something else entirely. This skill came from watching my father operate. Gene Cole was the kind of man who never raised his voice in a negotiation because he never had to. He understood people well enough to know what they needed to hear, and he was honest enough that what he told them was always true, which meant that when he spoke in a professional context, people listened and believed him. I spent my childhood watching him do this. I absorbed it. After high school, I spent 2 years doing exactly what you did in Tulsa in 1985 when you were 18, and did not have a scholarship and did not have a plan. I worked construction labor, warehouse shifts, a 6-month stretch at a lumber yard where I learned more about materials and logistics in one season than most people learned in 4 years of a relevant degree. I also, during those 2 years, made my first genuine business observation. The lumber yard I worked at was owned by a man named Harold Petty. Harold was 60 at the time, had built the business from a single truck and a wholesale account, and was running it now with a combination of deep experience and almost no technology. Everything Harold did, he did from memory and from habit, and from the specific efficiency of someone who had been doing the same things for so long that the systems had become invisible. The problem was that Harold was the only person who could see those systems. When Harold was not there, things moved slower. Errors happened. Deliveries got confused. Customer calls did not get resolved because the person answering the phone did not have access to the knowledge that Harold carried entirely in his head. I watched this for 6 months. I started writing things down. Not in any official capacity, just in a spiral notebook I kept in my truck, the processes Harold used, the order in which he made decisions, the information he carried that nobody else had, the relationships between suppliers and customers that made the operation work. At the end of 6 months, I had documented most of how the yard actually ran. Harold found the notebook by accident one afternoon when I had left it on the break room table. He asked me what it was. I told him. He read through it for 20 minutes. He said, "You did this on your own time." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because when you are not here, things go wrong in specific ways. The notebook is why." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. He said, "How old are you?" I said, 19. He said, "You want to be an operations manager." I said, "I want to understand how things work well enough to make them work better. Whatever that is called is fine with me." Harold hired me as a yard supervisor 6 weeks later. I was 20 years old. That was the beginning. Not the beginning of wealth, not the beginning of the company I eventually built, the beginning of understanding what I was actually good at and why that thing had value. Operations, systems, the specific discipline of taking something that existed inside one person's head and building a structure around it that worked whether that person was there or not. Harold paid me fairly, more fairly than I expected, and he taught me, in the 3 years I worked for him, more about running a small business than any degree program could have produced. He was opinionated and direct, and he said what he meant, which was the kind of working environment I had been raised for. When I left Harold's yard at 23 to take a job with a larger building materials distributor in Oklahoma City, he shook my hand at the door and said, "Whoever hires you next is getting more than they're paying for." He was right about that. They were. And I intended to eventually correct that imbalance by working for myself. The building materials distribution company in Oklahoma City was called Meridian Supply Group. 300 employees, regional coverage across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas, 3 distribution centers, and a fleet of 47 trucks. Solid company, well run in the broad sense, struggling in the specific sense of a company that had grown faster than its operational infrastructure had been designed to support. I saw this in the first week. I said nothing for the first 3 months. I watched. I documented. I learned the existing system from the inside before offering any opinion about how it could be better, because I had seen enough of what happened when someone new walked into an organization and immediately started explaining how everything should change. The organization closed around them like water closing over a stone, and nothing moved. So I watched. At the end of 3 months, I had a document. Not a complaint, not a wish list, a specific operational analysis that identified 8 areas where the current system was producing delays, errors, or unnecessary cost, with a proposed solution for each one ranked by implementation complexity and projected return. I gave it to my direct supervisor on a Tuesday morning. He passed it up. By the end of that week, the vice president of operations, a man named Tom Breckner, had called me into his office. He said, "You have been here 3 months." I said, "Yes." He said, "You wrote this in 3 months." I said, "I started writing it on day 4. He said, "Where did you get your operations background?" I said, "A lumber yard in Tulsa and 3 years of paying attention." Tom looked at the document and looked at me and said, "What would it take to implement this?" I said, 6 months, the right team, and someone at your level who was willing to have the uncomfortable conversations about the processes people had been comfortable with for too long." He said, "I can do the third thing. Can you do the first 2? I said, "Yes." He promoted me to senior operations analyst that same month. 18 months later, I was director of distribution operations. By the time I was 28, I was running the entire logistics division of a regional company with 400 employees and a fleet of 63 vehicles, an annual revenue that my father's entire working career had never approached. I was not wealthy at 28. I was experienced. And I understood, from watching Harold and from watching Tom, and from the 4 years at Meridian, exactly what kind of company I was going to build when the time was right. The time came at 31. I gave Tom Breckner 3 months' notice. He tried to counter. I said, "What I want to build is not something I can build inside this company, but what I learned here is part of why I can build it." He shook my hand. He said, "Call me when you need a reference." He has been a reference 4 times since then. The company I started was called Cole Logistics Solutions. 1 rented warehouse unit on the south side of Oklahoma City. 1 truck I had bought at auction and had serviced by a mechanic I trusted. 1 contract from a building materials company that had been a Meridian customer and that had heard I was starting something and had called me directly. That 1 contract was the foundation. Not because of the revenue it generated, which was modest in the first year. Because of what it required me to build to service it correctly. The systems, the documentation, the operational structure that did not depend on me being present for every decision. The thing I had been studying in other people's companies for 9 years and that I now had to build from scratch in my own. I built it. Carefully, methodically, with the specific discipline of a man who had grown up watching a kitchen ledger and who understood that the gap between income and expenses was the only number that actually mattered at the end of every month. In year 1, the gap was small. In year 2, it was real. In year 3, I hired my first 3 employees and moved into a larger warehouse. By year 7, Cole Logistics Solutions had 12 full-time employees, a fleet of 9 vehicles, contracts with 22 clients across Oklahoma and Texas, an annual revenue that crossed $2 million for the first time. I was 38 years old. I had built it from 1 contract and 1 auction truck, and 9 years of watching other people's operations and understanding exactly what they were doing wrong. That was the year I met Karen. Karen Whitfield was 35 when we met. She had a daughter named Mia, who was 9 at the time, and a son named Ryan, who was 14. Their father, Corinne's first husband, had left the marriage when Ryan was 11 and Mia was 6. He had not left dramatically. He had simply stopped showing up in the specific gradual way of men who had already checked out emotionally before the actual departure, and whose physical absence was almost a formality by the time it happened. Corinne had raised them alone for 3 years before I met her. Not struggling exactly. She had a stable job in hospital administration and her own modest house in Edmond, a suburb north of Oklahoma City, and she had managed the household with the specific competence of someone who had learned that competence was not optional. We met at a Chamber of Commerce event. She was there representing the hospital. I was there because a colleague had told me the contacts were worth the 90 minutes. We ended up at the same table. She asked what I did. I explained. She asked specific questions about the logistics side that told me she understood business better than most people I met at these events. I asked what she did. She explained. I asked specific questions. We talked for the full 90 minutes, and then for another hour after most of the room had cleared. I asked if I could call her. She said, yes, but I want you to know up front that I have 2 kids, and that is the most important fact about my life right now. I said, I understand. She said, some people say that and then find out what it actually means and decide they understood a different thing than what it actually is. I said, I grew up in a house where my father was present every day without exception. I know what that looks like and what it costs, and I am not going to pretend I understand something I have not yet experienced, but I am willing to find out what it actually means. She looked at me for a moment. She said, okay. We dated for 14 months. In those 14 months, I spent time with Ryan and Mia in the specific careful way of someone who understood they were guests in a situation they had not created, and who had no interest in rushing something that required time to be real. Mia was easy. She was 10 by the time I was around regularly, and she had the open warmth of a child who had not yet built walls and who responded to consistent presence with simple trust. We liked the same movies. She thought my warehouse was the most interesting building she had ever seen. She asked about the trucks with the genuine curiosity of a child who wanted to understand how things worked, which was a quality I recognized immediately because it was the quality I had recognized in myself at her age. Ryan was different. Not hostile, not rude, reserved in the way of a 14-year-old boy who had watched his father leave and who had made a quiet private calculation about what that meant for every adult man who came into his life afterward. He watched me. He did not open up quickly. He asked hard questions when he did speak, the kind that were designed to find the inconsistency between what you said and what you actually meant. I respected this. I answered every question directly. I did not try to buy his approval with experiences or gifts. I showed up consistently, and I said what I meant, and I let time do the work that time was the only thing capable of doing. By the time Corinne and I married, Ryan was 16. He called me Warren. Not Dad, not anything else, Warren. That was acceptable. That was his right. I had not fathered him. I had entered his life when he was already mostly formed. The name Warren was honest, and I preferred honesty to performance. What I did not know, standing at that wedding at 39 years old with Corinne beside me and Mia as the flower girl and Ryan in a jacket he had chosen himself, was what the next 6 years were going to reveal about the boy I had committed to helping raise. I found out slowly, and then all at once. Subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell, because what Ryan became over the next 6 years is the part of this story that I did not see coming, and that forced me to make decisions I had never expected to make. Section 2 starts right now. The first 2 years of the marriage were the years I would describe, if someone asked me to describe them honestly, as genuinely good. Not perfect. Nothing with a blended family was perfect in the first 2 years because blended families required a recalibration of every relationship in the house simultaneously. And that recalibration happened at different speeds for different people and occasionally produced friction that was nobody's specific fault. But good, real, worth the work. Karen and I worked well together. We had the specific compatibility of two people who had each spent years managing things alone and who therefore understood what it meant to actually share the management rather than to divide it in ways that produced resentment over time. We talked about money. We talked about the kids. We talked about the business, which she understood well enough to ask the questions that helped me think more clearly about it. Mia thrived. She was 11 and 12 and 13 in those first 2 years, and she brought a warmth to the house that made everything around her feel lighter. She started calling me Dad about 8 months in, on a Sunday morning at breakfast, without preamble or announcement. She just said it the way you said a word you had been practicing in private and were ready to use out loud. I did not make a big moment of it. I said, "Good morning, Mia." She smiled and ate her cereal, and that was the whole thing. It was the whole thing, and it was enough. Ryan was harder to read in those years. Not because he was a bad kid. He was not. He was smart and he could be funny, and he had the specific sharp observation of someone who paid attention to things. But there was something in Ryan that did not settle, a restlessness, an impatience with the pace of things, a sense that whatever was in front of him was not moving fast enough toward wherever he believed he was supposed to be. He was 16 and 17 in those years. I understood that some of what I was watching was age. 16 and 17 were the years when the gap between what you wanted and what was available to you was widest and most visible and most frustrating. I had been 16 and 17, and I remembered the specific weight of wanting things you could not yet reach. But there was something else in Ryan that was separate from age. A relationship with money that I had not seen develop the way the relationship with money in our household was supposed to develop. He had everything he needed. He had most of what he wanted. He had an allowance that was generous relative to what I had been given at the same age. He had a phone. He had clothes. He had a laptop. He had access to things that I had worked 4 years to earn at his age and that he had access to simply by virtue of living in my house. He did not seem to understand any of this as a gift. He seemed to understand it as a baseline, the minimum acceptable starting point, the floor beneath which things should not fall rather than the ceiling that represented real comfort. I noticed this. I mentioned it to Karen twice in those first 2 years. Gently, without accusation, as an observation about something I thought was worth paying attention to. Karen heard me. She took it seriously. She had conversations with Ryan about money and work and the relationship between the two that I was not always present for, but that she reported back to me honestly. Ryan heard the conversations. He adjusted his behavior while she was watching. He did not adjust his understanding. That distinction became very clear in year 3 of the marriage, when Ryan turned 18, and I made the decision that I had been planning since year 1. I set up a trust fund. The trust was designed with a specific structure that I had worked out with my attorney over the course of several months. The principal was $200,000. It was accessible to Ryan on 2 conditions. He completed a 4-year degree at an accredited university, and he maintained a GPA above the minimum threshold the university required for continued enrollment. Outside of the trust, I also committed to covering his college tuition directly, paid to the institution, not to Ryan. This was the plan I had built. I told Ryan about it on his 18th birthday at the kitchen table. I told him about the trust, about the tuition commitment, about the conditions. He looked at the documents I had printed. He said, "What if I want to access the money before I graduate?" I said, "The structure does not allow it until the conditions are met." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because money without a foundation to build on produces a different kind of person than money that comes after you have built one. The trust is designed to be a reward for completing the foundation, not a substitute for building it." He said, "What if I need money for something before then?" I said, "That is what the allowance and the summer job are for." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "And if I choose not to go to college?" I said, "Then the trust remains in place until you are 25 and reassesses at that point based on what you have built in the meantime. College is not the only path, but it is the path with the most clearly defined structure for a person who has not yet demonstrated what alternative path they are on." He said, "So you control when I get it?" I said, "The trust controls when you get it. I set the trust up. There is a difference." He said nothing else. He took the documents. He went to his room. Corinne asked me later that night how I thought it had gone. I said he heard it. Whether he accepted it is a different question. She said, "You think he will be okay?" I said, "I think he will make choices that tell us who he is." This was the first real one. The first real choice Ryan made was to enroll in the University of Oklahoma in the fall. I covered the tuition. I set up the meal plan. I added him to the family insurance. He had everything he needed to succeed at school. Year 1 of college was acceptable. His grades were not impressive, but they were passing. He came home for breaks. He was pleasant enough at the dinner table. He had a part-time job at a campus restaurant for the first semester that he quit in the second semester for reasons that were not fully explained, but that Corinne accepted without pushing. Year 2 was different. The grades dropped in the first semester, not catastrophically but noticeably. I paid the tuition for the second semester with a conversation attached about the trajectory and what it needed to look like going forward. Ryan said, "I understand." He said it in the tone of someone who was managing the conversation rather than participating in it. The second semester grades were not better. We had a more direct conversation at the end of year 2. I said, "Ryan, the trust fund has conditions. The tuition commitment also has an implied condition, which is that the education is being taken seriously. What I am seeing does not look like serious to me." He said, "I am doing fine." I said, "Fine is not the standard. The standard is building something." He said, "I am building things you cannot see." I said, "Tell me about them." He described social connections and networking opportunities, and the broader college experience in language that was fluent, and that contained no specific information whatsoever. I said, "I hear you. Show me with the grades." Year 3 started. The grades did not improve. Something else happened instead. Ryan got into debt. I found out the way I found out most things about Ryan in those years, which was sideways, through information that arrived from somewhere other than Ryan himself. A friend of Corinne's mentioned at a dinner that she had heard Ryan owed money to someone on campus. She was careful about it. She did not have details. She had heard something and thought we should know. I thanked her for telling us. Corinne and I talked that night. She was upset, not at the friend, at the situation, at the specific combination of worry and anger that parents felt when they learned something about a child that the child had been actively choosing not to tell them. I said, "Let me find out the actual situation before we decide anything." I called Ryan. He was evasive in the first call. He said he had some financial stuff he was managing. He said it was under control. I said, "How much?" He said, "It is fine." I said, "Ryan, how much?" Pause. He said, 11,000. He said it the way people said large numbers when they had been sitting with them long enough that the shock of the number had worn off, but the weight of it had not. I said, "To who?" He said, "Credit cards mostly, and some from people at school." I said, "Some from people at school." He said, "I know it looks bad." I said, "It looks like you have been living beyond what you have access to and borrowing to cover the gap and not telling anyone about it." He said, "I was handling it." I said, "How?" He said, "I had a plan." I said, "What plan?" He described something that was not a plan. It was a hope, a sequence of things he believed would happen that would produce the money to pay back the debt, none of which had happened, all of which were dependent on other things happening first. I said, "Come home this weekend. We need to sit down together." He came home. We sat down together. Karen was there. I was there. Ryan sat across from us at the kitchen table where 2 years before I had laid out the trust fund documents and explained the conditions. I said, $11,000. Tell me the full picture. He told us. Credit cards he had opened without telling us. A loan from a friend that had ballooned with informal interest. 2 months of unpaid rent on an off-campus apartment he had moved into without telling Karen, which was itself a revelation that produced a separate conversation. The full number was closer to 14,000. I said, "Here is what I can do. I will cover the credit card debt directly to prevent the interest from compounding further. The loan from the friend you handle yourself through legitimate means. You move back into campus housing, which I will cover as part of the tuition commitment. And we have a monthly check-in call where I see the bank account statement." He said, "The monthly check-in is not necessary." I said, "It is necessary." He said, "I am an adult." I said, "Adults who manage their money responsibly do not accumulate $14,000 of hidden debt while someone else covers their tuition and living costs. When I see the behavior that matches the claim, the oversight goes away. Until then, it stays." Ryan agreed. He came back home for the summer. He was polite. He was also, I understood in retrospect, watching the house the way a man watched a situation he was planning to take advantage of. I did not see it at the time. I saw a young man who had made mistakes and who was being given a clear path to correct them. I was looking at the path. He was looking at the garage. The car in the garage was a 2019 Land Rover Defender. I had bought it 2 years earlier, paid cash. It was the first vehicle I had ever purchased that was genuinely expensive and that I had purchased for no reason other than I had wanted it for a long time and had built something large enough that I could own it without it affecting anything else in the operation. It was not a daily driver. I drove a company truck for most of my working week. The Defender was the weekend vehicle, the Saturday morning vehicle, the specific physical object that represented to me personally the distance between the 20-year-old writing things down in a spiral notebook in a Tulsa lumber yard and the 54-year-old man who had built a company worth 4 times what he had ever expected. Ryan knew about the car. He had driven it once with me in the passenger seat and had commented that it drove well. I had said, "It does. It is a good vehicle." He had said nothing else about it. That was the summer before his junior year. On a Tuesday in October of his junior year, I was at the warehouse handling a contract renewal with one of our largest Texas clients, an all-day situation. I had been there since 6 in the morning, and I was going to be there until at least 6 in the evening. At 2:15 p.m., my phone showed a notification from the home security system. Someone had opened the garage door. I looked at the notification and I thought, Ryan is home from school for the week. He mentioned he was coming back Tuesday. I went back to the contract meeting. At 4:40 p.m., I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I answered. A man said, "Is this Warren Cole?" I said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Jeff. I just bought a Land Rover Defender from a Ryan Whitfield. He showed me the title, says he is the owner. The paperwork checks out. The title is in the name of Warren Cole and Ryan Whitfield as co-owner. The room went cold. I said, there is no co-ownership. That title should have only one name on it. He said, it has two. I have the document in my hand. I said, when did you take possession? He said, about 3 hours ago. I have the keys in the vehicle, paid $48,000 cash. I said, do not go anywhere. I need to call you back. I ended the call. I sat at the conference table in the warehouse office with 6 people around me working through contract details, and I processed what had just happened. Ryan had accessed my filing cabinet. At some point, without my knowledge, he had taken the title to the defender and added his own name to it through some process I did not yet understand. He had found a buyer. He had sold the vehicle. He had taken $48,000 in cash. He had done all of this on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was 30 miles away in a contract meeting. I excused myself from the meeting. I drove home. Ryan was in the kitchen. He was making food. He heard me come in. He turned around. He saw my face. He said, "Hey." I said, "Where is the car, Ryan?" He said, "I sold it." I said, "You sold my car." He said, "I needed the money to cover the debt. The bank was threatening to send it to collections, and that would have affected my credit score for 7 years. I needed to fix it, and I fixed it." I said, "You took the title from my filing cabinet." He said, "It was in the office, yeah." I said, "And you added your name to it?" He said, "I found out I could do that as a household resident. I looked it up. It is technically legal." I looked at this young man who was standing in my kitchen, eating something I had paid for in a house I had paid for, wearing clothes I had paid for, and telling me he had sold my $62,000 car and that it was technically legal. I said, "Ryan, that was my vehicle. The money from that sale is not yours." He said, "I needed it." I said, "You needed it?" He said, "Yes, and you were not going to give it to me. I asked you about the trust fund twice this semester and you said no both times." I said, "The trust fund has conditions that you have not met." He said, "So I found another way." He said it with the specific flatness of someone who had been rehearsing the justification for long enough that it had lost its emotional edge. And then he added the thing that I will not forget for as long as I live. He looked at me and he crossed his arms and he said, "What are you going to do about it?" He said it with a smirk. A 20-year-old who had never worked a real job, who had never covered his own rent, who had never sat across from a bank manager with nothing in his account and real obligations coming due, who had lived in my house and eaten my food and been funded through school on my commitment. He looked at me and smirked and said, "What are you going to do about it?" I said nothing. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I am going to think." I went upstairs. Karen was not home yet. She was at a work event that evening. I sat in the bedroom. I called my attorney. I called the trust fund administrator. I called the university's billing office. I called the property manager who handled the formal lease documentation for the house, which was structured in a way that gave me specific rights over who resided there as a condition of the property's insurance and mortgage terms. I made 4 calls in 40 minutes. Then I went back downstairs. Ryan was watching television in the living room. I said, "Ryan, I want you to understand something." He looked up. I said, "I am not angry. I want you to hear that clearly. I am completely clear-headed right now, and what I am going to do is answer your question." He said, "What question?" I said, "What am I going to do about it?" I looked at him. I said, "You will find out tomorrow evening." I went to bed. I was up at 4:30 the next morning. I drove to the office. I spent 2 hours on the phone, completing what I had started the night before. The university's enrollment office confirmed that the tuition payment for the current semester had been made and could not be reversed, but that future semester enrollment could be canceled and would not be automatically renewed without a new payment authorization, which I withdrew immediately. The trust fund administrator confirmed that the trust was frozen pending a formal review, which I had requested the night before. Ryan would receive a certified letter explaining the freeze within 3 business days. The attorney confirmed that the title situation was legally complicated, but that Ryan's modification of the title without my knowledge or consent was challengeable, and that the buyer, who I had spoken to again that morning, had agreed to hold the vehicle until the legal status was clarified. The buyer was cooperative. He was uncomfortable with the situation and wanted it resolved cleanly. The property manager confirmed that as the primary homeowner and mortgage holder, I had the right to change the residence access under the existing terms, provided Karen was in agreement. I told him I needed to speak with Karen first before proceeding on that specific piece. I called Karen. I told her everything. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. It was the hardest conversation of our marriage, not because we disagreed about what Ryan had done, because we disagreed initially about what the response should be. Karen's first instinct was to protect. She is a mother. That is not a criticism. That is the most honest description of what was happening on her side of that call. Her son had done something wrong, and her first instinct was to absorb the consequence before it landed on him in full force. I understood that instinct. I said, Karen, I hear you, and I need you to hear me. If we absorb this, we are not protecting Ryan. We are teaching him that what he did works, that the smirk was the right response. She said, he is 20 years old. I said, I was 20 years old when I was running a lumber yard. I was not stealing vehicles from people who trusted me. She was quiet. I said, I'm not asking you to hate your son. I'm asking you to let him learn the most important lesson of his life before the real world teaches it to him in a way that costs him something that cannot be replaced. What I am going to do costs him things that can all be recovered. The tuition can be paid again when he earns it. The trust fund can be accessed when he meets the conditions. The house will be available when the terms are met. She said, what are the terms? I said, I want to talk to him first. Tonight, together, we set the terms together. She said, okay. She came home. We talked. We agreed on what the response looked like. And then Karen drove to the grocery store so that what happened next happened between me and Ryan without her in the room, because she had asked me to handle the first part. I changed the locks at 4 in the afternoon. I packed a bag with Ryan's essentials, clothing, toiletries, his laptop, his chargers, and left it in a duffel bag on the porch. I taped a folded piece of paper to the front door. On the paper, I wrote 3 words: "Welcome to the real world." Then I went inside and waited. Stay right here. Subscribe to this channel right now. Ring that notification bell, because what happened when Ryan came home that evening is the part of this story that changed the direction of everything that came after it. Ryan came home at 7:18 p.m. My neighbor called me at 7:22. She said, Warren, Ryan is on your porch. He has been standing there for a few minutes. He looks like he is reading something. I thought you should know. I said, thank you, Linda. She said, is everything okay? I said, it will be. At 7:31, my phone rang. Ryan. I answered. He said, what is this? His voice had lost the flatness. It had lost the rehearsed quality. What was in it instead was the specific register of someone who had encountered a reality that was larger than the scenario they had prepared for. I said, it is exactly what it looks like. He said, you changed the locks. I said, yes. He said, you cannot do this. I said, I own the house, Ryan. I hold the mortgage. You are not on any of the legal documentation for this property. I can absolutely do this. He said, where am I supposed to go? I said, "That is the first real question you have asked me in a long time. I want you to sit with it for a while." He said, "Warren." I said, "Yes." He said, "This is not fair." I said, "You sold my car without asking me. You smirked at me and asked what I was going to do about it. What you are experiencing right now is the answer." Silence. He said, "I need to talk to my mom." I said, "Your mom knows about all of this. We talked today. This is a decision we made together." Another silence, longer. He said, "She agreed to this." I said, "She agreed that you needed to experience the real weight of what you did." "Yes." He said, "I have nowhere to go." I said, "You have $48,000 in cash from the sale of a vehicle you did not own. That money will be handled through the legal process. In the meantime, you are 20 years old and you have the same options that every 20-year-old has who has exhausted the goodwill of the people who were supporting them." He said, "You are serious." I said, "I have never been more serious in my life." He said, "Warren." I said, "Ryan, there is a duffel bag on the porch with your clothes and your laptop. Call a friend. Find a place to stay tonight. Tomorrow morning at 9, your mother and I want to meet with you at the kitchen table, not to punish you further, to talk about what comes next and what the path back looks like." He said, "The path back." I said, "There is always a path back. That is the other part of welcome to the real world. The world is hard. The world also gives you another chance if you show up for it correctly." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, 9 o'clock. I said, 9 o'clock. He picked up the bag. He called a college friend who lived 20 minutes away. He stayed there that night. At 9 o'clock the next morning, he was at the kitchen table. The kitchen table meeting was the most honest conversation Ryan and I had ever had. Not the most comfortable, the most honest. Karen sat between us in the physical sense. In the actual sense, she sat beside me, which was where she had been from the moment I had called her from the office the morning before. Ryan looked different at that table than he had looked at any other table in the 6 years I had been in his life. The smirk was gone. What was there instead was something rawer, younger somehow. The specific look of a person who had been moving through life at the speed of someone who believed they understood how it worked and who had just found out they had been working from an incorrect map. I let him sit in it for a moment before I spoke. I said, "I want to ask you something before we talk about what happens next." He said, "Okay." I said, "Yesterday, when you said, 'What are you going to do about it?' what did you actually believe the answer was going to be?" He was quiet. I said, "I am not asking to make you feel worse. I am asking because the answer tells me something important about what we need to address." He said, "I thought you would be angry. I thought there would be a big argument. And then I thought Mom would be in the middle of it, and eventually it would settle down and things would go back to how they were, and I would still have the money and the debt would be gone." He said it slowly, like he was hearing it for the first time as he said it. He said, "I thought you would absorb it." I said, "Like I absorbed the 14,000. He said, "Yes." I said, "And before that, the apartment you moved into without telling us." He said, "Yes." I said, "And the dropped grades." He said, "Yes." I said, "Ryan, every time I absorbed something, what did you conclude?" He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "That it worked." I said, "Yes, that it worked. That taking and not asking and expecting the consequences to be managed by someone else was a strategy that functioned. And it functioned because I kept making it function by absorbing it." Karen reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She did not speak. She did not need to. I said, "I am not your enemy. I have never been your enemy. I have been trying to give you what I did not have at your age, which is a foundation that did not require you to build everything from scratch. But I gave it wrong. I gave it in a way that taught you the foundation was a right instead of a starting point. He said, I know. I said, do you? He said, I am starting to. I said, here is what the path forward looks like. The legal situation with the car gets resolved properly. You will cooperate with my attorney. The $48,000 goes to the buyer who paid it in good faith. Your additional debt gets handled through a structured payment plan that you fund through actual work. The trust fund remains frozen until you demonstrate 18 consecutive months of financial self-management. And the university situation. He said, you canceled my enrollment. I said, I canceled the automatic renewal of my payment. Your enrollment is intact for this semester. If you want to continue next semester, we need to talk about what that continuation looks like and what you are willing to put toward it yourself. He said, I cannot pay for college. I said, not right now, no. But you can apply for financial aid. You can get a real job. You can demonstrate that you understand the difference between what is yours and what belongs to someone else. And when I see that demonstration consistently over time, we talk about what support looks like going forward. He looked at the table. He said, Mom. Karen said, I love you, Ryan. This is me loving you. He looked at her. He said, this is what loving me looks like. She said, yes. This is what it looks like when I stop protecting you from the thing you need to learn. He was quiet for a long time. He said, what if I fail? I said, then you fail and you get up and you try again. That is what every person who has ever built anything has done. That is the entire story of how real things get built. He looked at me. He said, you are going to keep checking on me. I said, I am going to be available if you need me. That is different from checking on you. You are 20 years old. The checking stops here. The availability stays. He said, you really mean that? I said, I have meant everything I have ever said to you. That has always been true. You just did not believe it until now. The legal resolution with the car took 3 months. Ryan cooperated fully once he understood the actual scope of what he had done. The title modification was ruled improper based on the lack of my knowledge or consent. The buyer was made whole from funds recovered from Ryan's account, combined with a payment plan that Ryan signed without argument. The defender came back to me with 5,000 additional miles and a new scratch on the rear bumper that I chose not to pursue. Ryan moved into a shared apartment in Norman with 2 other guys from school. He applied for financial aid. He got a job at a sporting goods store, working 22 hours a week alongside a full course load. His grades in the spring semester were the best he had produced in 3 years of college. He called me on a Sunday in March, not to ask for something, to talk. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me about a business class he was taking where the professor had the class build a basic financial model for a hypothetical company. He told me his model had gotten the highest grade in the class. I said, tell me about the model. He told me. I asked specific questions. He answered them in detail. At the end of the call, he said, Warren. I said, yeah. He said, how did you know the business was going to work when you started it? I said, I did not know. I knew the problem was real and I knew I understood the problem better than most people. The rest was work. He said, work and what else? I said, work and documentation. Work and understanding that the gap between what you want and what you have is not a problem. It is a description of the distance you need to travel. The problem is deciding you are owed the destination before you have traveled it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, that is what I did. I said, yes. He said, with the car and with everything before it. I said, yes. He said, I thought the destination was already mine. I said, I know you did. Part of that is my fault for not making the distance more visible earlier. He said, no, you made it visible. I just decided I did not want to travel it. He said, I am traveling it now. I said, I know. He said, is that enough? I said, traveling it honestly is enough. Everything else is just time. Karen and I had the hardest conversation of our marriage the week after the lock change. The week when everything was still raw and the outcome was still unclear. She had held her position. She had sat at that table and told her son that what was happening was her loving him. She had held it because she understood in the deepest part of herself that it was true. But she had also been honest with me that night, when Ryan had gone to his friend's place and the house was quiet. She said, I need to tell you something. I said, tell me. She said, when you called me from the office and told me what he had done, my first reaction was not anger at Ryan. I said, what was it? She said, it was fear that I was going to have to choose between you and him. I said, you do not have to choose between us. She said, I know, but I felt it for about an hour. I want you to know that, because you handled this with more patience and more clarity than I had, and you deserve to know that I saw that. I said, you came to the right place. She said, I came to you. I said, that is what I mean. She said, I need to ask you something. I said, ask. She said, do you resent him? Do you resent what he did and what it cost us to handle it? I looked at my wife. I said, resent is not the right word. Resent is what you felt when someone did something to you that was arbitrary and without cause. Ryan did not act without cause. He acted from what he had been taught by the way things had gone up until that moment. That teaching was mine as much as anyone's. So no, resent is not what I feel. She said, what do you feel? I said, I feel like we are on the right side of the hardest part, and I feel like Ryan is going to be okay. She said, because of the grades. I said, because of the phone call. He called to talk and he stayed on the line for 40 minutes and he asked real questions and he listened to the answers. That is not the behavior of someone who is performing a recovery to get back the things they lost. That is the behavior of someone who is actually learning something. She said, and if you are wrong? I said, then I am wrong and we figure out the next step from there. But I do not think I am wrong. She reached across and held my hand the same way she had held it at the kitchen table. She said, 6 years of Sunday dinners and homework help, and not asking to be called anything you had not earned. I said, that is just showing up. She said, it is never just showing up. It is the most important thing there is. Ryan graduated 23 months after the kitchen table meeting. He graduated on time, which meant he had completed the final 18 months of his degree at a pace and with grades that qualified him for the conditions of the trust fund. The trust fund released on the day of his graduation. $200,000. He did not spend it immediately. He called me from outside the ceremony, in his robe, with the noise of 3,000 other graduates in the background. He said it cleared. I said, I know. The administrator confirmed this morning. He said, I want to ask your opinion on something. I said, okay. He said, I want to use part of it to clear the remaining debt from the payment plan, and I want to put the rest into a vehicle that grows it. But I do not know enough about investment vehicles to make the right choice, and I do not want to make the wrong one. I said, come to the office on Monday. I will show you what I know and we will figure out what makes sense for your situation. He said, your office. I said, Cole Logistics, yes. He said, you want to meet at your office. I said, it is where I work, yes. He said, okay. He was quiet for a second. He said, Warren. I said, yeah. He said, thank you for the note on the door. I said, welcome to the real world. He laughed. He actually laughed. It was the most honest laugh I had heard from him in years. He said, yeah, welcome to the real world. He went back to his graduation. I sat at my desk in the warehouse office in Oklahoma City, with the afternoon sun coming through the west windows, the way it came through every afternoon in June, warm and indifferent, and exactly the same as it had been coming through those windows since the day I signed the lease. I thought about a 20-year-old in a Tulsa lumber yard, writing things down in a spiral notebook. I thought about a first contract in a single auction truck. I thought about Harold Petty reading the notebook for 20 minutes over the break room table and asking how old I was. I thought about the ledger in the kitchen drawer and the 2 columns and the discipline of knowing what you had before you decided what to spend. I thought about a smirk and what you did about it. You showed up the next morning. You made the calls. You wrote 3 words on a piece of paper. And then you stayed available for 2 years while someone learned what the real world actually was. That was what you did about it. Here is what I want to say to close this out. This story is not about the car. The car is just the object that made everything visible at once. What the story is actually about is the specific mistake that well-meaning people made when they absorbed consequences on behalf of someone else repeatedly enough that the person stopped being able to see the connection between their choices and their outcomes. I made that mistake. I made it because I wanted to give Ryan what I had not had at his age. I wanted him to have a foundation. I wanted him to have stability. I wanted him to enter his adult life from a position of support rather than from the position I had entered mine, which was 19 years old in a lumber yard writing things down in a notebook because I needed to understand something and no one was going to hand me the understanding. The mistake was not giving him support. The mistake was giving support without visible conditions for long enough that the conditions became theoretical rather than real. The note on the door was not revenge. It was a condition becoming real. And the kitchen table meeting the next morning was what came after the condition became real, which was the conversation that needed to happen for years, and that had been deferred because absorbing things was easier in the short term than having the conversation. Nothing about what happened was easy. None of it felt good in the moment. But here is what I know now that I did not know clearly enough before. The most loving thing you can do for someone who has been learning that the world will absorb their choices is to stop absorbing, to let the real world do its job. Because the real world is a far more effective teacher than any version of the speech I could have given Ryan across a dinner table. The speech passes through the air and gets processed and filed. The real world lands differently. The real world is the locked door and the duffel bag on the porch, and the note that says welcome to this. Ryan is 24 now. He works in corporate operations for a mid-sized company in Dallas. He is good at his job. He calls me on Sundays sometimes, not every week, but sometimes, and we talk about the work and what he is learning in it, and occasionally about the business and how it is going on my end. He called me Dad for the first time 6 months after the graduation. Not in a big moment, not in a speech. In the middle of a phone call about something else, he used the word and kept talking, and I let him keep talking because making a moment of it would have made it smaller than it was. I told Corinne that evening. She cried. The good kind. The kind that came from watching something she had hoped for actually arrive. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. If any part of this connected with you, like this video right now, it takes 1 second and it means more than you know. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. Every week I have a story that is real and that goes somewhere unexpected. I am not going anywhere and I want you to be here. Share this with someone who is in the position I was in, absorbing things for someone they love and wondering if there is another way. There is another way. It is harder in the short term. It works better in the long one. Comment below. Tell me what you think about Ryan. Tell me what you would have done differently. Tell me if you have been the Warren in this story or if you have been the Ryan. I want to hear it. Every comment gets read. Every story matters.